Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create a neon Father's Day card. My husband absolutely loves neon. His favorite color is fluorescent green. So these neon lunar pastes are absolutely perfect for him. There's actually 6 colors total. I only got 3 of them. I got the pink, the blue, and the yellow. They're called No Chill, Voltage, and Hot Mess. And I figured that I could mix the blue and the yellow to create green, the blue and the pink to create purple, and the pink and the yellow to create orange. Or at least I wanted to try and see if it would work, and it actually worked pretty good. So I mixed the green off on my surface here because it was important that I had some fluorescent green in these backgrounds. Now I have a couple of pieces of cardstock here that I'm going to work on, and I taped them down to my surface with some painter's tape so that I could use my palette knife on them and not have to worry about the paper moving around while I was working on it. I wanted to cover the paper pretty much fully, and by having them taped down, I didn't have to worry about getting my fingers in the paste, and I could also make sure to get as much on the surface of the paper as possible. So I have a wide putty tool here. It's going to work perfectly for this paste. Simon Hurley does have his own paste tools. I don't happen to have them. Anytime I've gone to order them, they've always been back ordered. So I just am working with what I have, and it's going to work perfectly for this project. At some point I will get the official tools, but this is going to work. You just need something that's got a nice flat edge so that you can get a nice even amount over your paper. And I do go back over several times to try to make those colors blend a little bit with each other, as well as get as smooth a coat across the paper as possible. So I'm going to put as much of that paste onto the paper, and I'd rather have it on the paper than on my palette knife and end up having to wash it off the palette knife and have it go down the drain. So I'm just trying to make my coats as even as possible. And then I wanted to see how it was going to look on black, but I didn't necessarily want to create a project with it. So I'm just cleaning off my palette tool onto that black cardstock. Now, off screen, I ended up having to do it over because at one point I went to check and see if the paste was dry, and my mind was on something completely different, and I just put my whole hand right on the whole background and actually ruined it because it wasn't dry. It's really going to depend on how thick you have the paste as to how long it's going to dry. So my redo, I did it and then I let it dry overnight, and I had only taped it on the left-hand side for the redo because it really only mattered that it was held down on the side that I started swiping over across the paper. I did more sheets than I needed. I only want to use one for this card, so the rest of them were going to be saved for other projects. So for the front of my card, my husband does construction. So I have the All Tools die set from Spellbinders, and I'm going to create some tools to go on the front of the card. Because my background is so bright with that neon paste, I decided to do a neutral palette for those tools. So I have some silver mirror stock, and I also have some black cardstock. However, I want to do one ruler or measuring tape with the black as well as some of the neon green. Now, this is an inside joke between my husband and I. We like to watch home improvement shows, and periodically we see some of them using measuring tapes with neon green and black. And he absolutely loves it, raves about it, and talks about how much he wants this tape. Well, or talked, because this is in the past. A couple years ago for Christmas, I got him one for Christmas. Looked all over the place, couldn't find one locally, so I went online and found one. It ended up, and I found this afterwards when I finally told him how much I paid for it, I ended up paying 3 times what a measuring tape is worth. And then a couple months later, he told me that it's actually in metric. And even though we're in Canada and we work in the metric system, in construction, they still do imperial. So he can't actually even use it at work anyways because it's metric. So it's just funny. He loves the tape, but he can't actually use it because it's metric. So I just thought it would be fun to put that green and black one on the inside of the card just for something to laugh at. So these ones that I'm doing with the mirror cardstock and the silver are going to be on the front of the card. That green and black one is going to be on the inside of the card, and he's going to think it's hilarious. So I have the mirror cardstock that I did for the large part of the tools, and then I cut the black to do the details, and I'm gluing that on top. Now, because the mirror cardstock has a coating on it, it is going to take a little bit longer to dry because it only dries from one side. So I'm gluing my pieces together with the Barely Art glue in the fine tip bottle, and I'm putting them under the acrylic block. I do this all the time anyways, but I am going to let them sit there longer than I normally so that glue can dry even more on that mirror cardstock. Now, this cardstock isn't super thick. It's a decently heavy cardstock, but I do want it to have a little bit more substance for the front of the card. So while I'm waiting for those pieces to dry underneath the acrylic block, I did die cut a bunch more with white scrap cardstock, and I'm going to layer that on the back of these pieces after they are dried so that it gives them a little bit more substance, makes them pop off the front of the card a little bit more. Now, this die set that I'm using has a ton of tools to choose from, and in reality, probably the only one that my husband actually uses at work is the hammer and his measuring tape. The rest he uses as power tools. So a lot of the tools that I'm using here are not really ones that he uses on the day-to-day basis at his work, but they will look great on the front of the card. So I am putting those extra pieces underneath there. I'm gluing everything with the Barely Art glue. I love gluing things with liquid glue because it gives you a little bit of room to shimmy things in place and make sure that the placement is perfect before that glue starts to grab the cardstock. I also find that liquid glue goes a really long way, so it tends to be very economical to use a nice liquid glue. Now, after I let the white cardstock dry between, I went and I die cut some black pieces of the upper handle of the saw. Because the mirror part of that saw was only the blade, it didn't have the extra pieces on the back of the handle, and I didn't want that little piece of cardstock flapping there. So I just die cut the top part of that piece to put on the back. And I did do 4 layers for that because one accounted for the silver mirror cardstock layer that was glued onto the back of that handle. While those pieces are drying, I am using the Mother's and Father's Day Better Press sentiment plate. This is a sentiment plate that has all of the sentiments on it, and it does it as one, but I really only want one Happy Father's Day. So I'm using a piece of scrap cardstock, taping it onto my clear plate, and then I have my plate on my Better Press placed so that I'm going to be just mainly doing that one sentiment. I put the Versamark ink on it, put my clear plate to my base, and then put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to put the pressure of that ink and plate onto the cardstock. And then I'm using some black embossing powder, and that's going to coordinate perfectly with the black details of the tools. Now, if by chance you get flecks of embossing powder where you don't want it to go, use a soft brush and brush them off. And you definitely want to do that before you're doing your embossing. If you've melted that embossing powder to your paper, it's too late. So I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder and make it go from the granular to the glossy, smooth black. And then I'm lining up the coordinating die to die cut that out. So I do like to use some yellow tape when I'm die cutting out sentiments. I want to make sure that those sentiments are not going to move on that sentiment while I'm running it through the die cutting machine. And I've never had an issue while I had them placed, as you just saw. When I had placed my die side up with the paper on top, I do find that that sentiment starts to ride. So for die cutting sentiments, I definitely do it face down where I can see the die as well as the sentiment. Now I have all of my pieces ready to go, and I can start layering my card together. So I have an A2 card base here. My black layer is 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I've trimmed down my neon lunar paste layer to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. That way I've got a nice black border around it that's also going to coordinate really nicely with the black detail of those tools. Now I want to make sure that I get some good placement of these die cuts on the front of the card, and because they are all different sizes and shapes, even though I know exactly what order they're going in, what I'm doing is I'm going to do the one on the left and then the one on the right, and then I'm going to just place my die cuts down to make sure that I like the spacing. I'm going to glue the center one, and then I'll just glue the other ones in between, and that way I can make sure that nothing moves, and I can also make sure that I like the placement as I'm going. By putting the one on the left and the right, I know exactly how far they can go. And if I were to say, start at the left and then move my way, to the right, there's a good chance that I would lose my placing or I would put something a little bit too close or too far. So by doing this, I can make sure that I like the spacing and nothing changes. So for the inside of the card, you could put the sentiment in there, and I have that ruler that I wanted to put in there, but I did decide to put this sentiment on the front of the card. And because I am gluing it to that mirror cardstock, I put my liquid glue on there and then put that acrylic block and leave it for a little while for that glue to completely dry. Because I had extra layers underneath my tools, I didn't do that with the sentiment, but if you wanted that tool or that sentiment to have a little bit more dimension, you certainly could. I wanted the inside of the card to kind of mimic the front of the card, so I did use the same layering as I did for the black piece and the neon piece for the inside of the card, except I used a piece of white cardstock, so you can easily write your sentiment on the inside of the card. And I figured I might as well have that gluing and drying while I was waiting for the sentiment to dry on the front of the card. Once that was done, I can put that piece on the inside of the card and we are ready to go. I absolutely love how this card turned out, and I love that bright neon background against the very simple color palette of those tools, and that mirror cardstock catches the light really, really well and makes them look a little bit more realistic, although my husband's tools aren't nearly that shiny. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.